Hello and welcome to the Hustle and Bustle podcast. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which this podcast is being recorded, the Yugambeh people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. My name's Nicole Bennett and I'm an urban and regional planner, and I'm the host of this podcast. Each episode I bring you conversations with city shapers and urban thinkers, leaders in the field of urban planning and city building. I'm located here on the beautiful Gold Coast in Australia. We're one of the host cities for the Brisbane 2032 Olympics and Paralympics. The next 10 years is being described as the golden decade for our city and our region. The conversations on this podcast help us understand the opportunities and challenges ahead. So let's take a minute from our busy hustle and bustle day and let's have a great conversation. And welcome to episode 14 for 2022. This is only the second time I've had an Arupian on the podcast, and I'm so pleased it's Patrick to be joining me today. Patrick Gorr is an associate principal based in Arup's Melbourne office. He's a senior finance, cost and project assurance specialist on major transformational commercial projects. Patrick's focus on private and public infrastructure finance, investor and commercial negotiation within the energy market. Specialising in commercial risk, financial analysis, strategy and modelling, Patrick leads teams responsible for designing, delivering and implementing major strategic and commercial projects across all sectors. He has worked on programs and projects throughout Australia, the UK and Europe. One of his key focus areas is on energy and hydrogen and the transition to net zero energy production. And Patrick's actually Arup's global hydrogen leader. Patrick's a chartered accountant by profession. He holds a Bachelor of Business, Economics, Accounting and International Trade from Swinburne University of Technology and has held senior strategic roles in Australia and Europe and within the Victorian Government, International Development Law Association and EDF Energy. What a bio. Welcome to the podcast, Patrick. How are you?
Great. Thanks, Nicole. Very excited to be here.
That's awesome. And is it chilly in Melbourne today?
Yeah, look, it's raining. It's raining heavily, but that's to be expected in Melbourne in June. So, we'd love to be up on the Gold Coast with you, enjoying some of the sunshine though.
Absolutely. Look, I have enjoyed working with you in Arup, and you are one of those people that is a bit of a genius, but also just has some of the. You are, and you have some of the most exciting projects and things going on, and. When the latest news sort of started coming out around energy, and the energy crisis that we're in, and the East Coast is now, apparently at risk of blackout due to peak demand and all of these things, I initially thought, I really need to get Patrick on the podcast because he'll be able to explain all of this to us. And your focus on that energy transition and the opportunities with hydrogen and what that can do for communities, I think would be really great and something I haven't covered at all on the podcast. So I'm hoping we can go through that today and see what we can tell our listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an exciting time. And I think, you and I were speaking about this, that we've kind of timed it perfectly in the sense that getting an energy person on your podcast in the middle of an energy crisis. So, I think, probably to start off, energy at the moment in Australia is in flux and has been for a long time. But what we're experiencing today is actually it's been building for a long time. So we've had a market operator and a market kind of regulator that's allowed free rein almost, or allowing the market to operate very freely for nearly a quarter of a century. And what's happened in the last couple of days is the unprecedented move where the market operator, AEMO, has intervened directly in the marketplace and ordered generators to come online and taken control of what electricity is being produced where and when. Now, to most people, we turn the lights on at home and the lights come on and we don't really experience blackouts and brownouts and that sort of stuff. I mean, there's been the odd one. Victoria had one. South Australia had obviously the 2016 total blackout. And we've had a few rolling brownouts in really hot summers. I'm sure you probably remember some of those where, you might hear the energy minister say, right, everybody in this part of the country is going to have a brownout between 2 p.m. and 4 p.m. or something like that, or can you all please turn your air conditioners off, or whatever it is, right? And that's kind of the extent of intervention we have in our market. So Australia's got three markets, but two main ones. So one is what we call the national electricity market, which runs across the eastern seaboard and South Australia and Tasmania. And then we've got the SWISH, which is the Southwestern Interconnector service, which is in southwestern Western Australia. And there's a NUIS as well, which is another interconnector in the northwestern part. But in terms of the markets, we've got the NEM is what we're talking about today, and that's where all of the problems have been. Because if you pick up the Western Australian papers from yesterday, they're talking about an oversupply of electricity in their market in the SWIS, which is and talking about how they're going to decommission Collie Power Station, which is a coal-fired power station in WA, early, so in 2027, which is obviously the exact opposite of what we're experiencing over on the East Coast. So what I think, what are we actually experiencing though? It's this perfect storm of aging coal-fired generators having what we call outages, and an outage is when they go offline, and you have both planned and unplanned outages. And that's a really important thing to understand, because a planned outage is when we have to do maintenance to the plant, and that's scheduled in. And so the plant will go offline, they'll do the maintenance. Usually it's a very stressful kind of 48 to 72 hours, and they'll do the maintenance and they'll come in and they'll put the plant back online. An unplanned outage is when something goes wrong. And that's when the electricity generation plant goes offline and they need to scramble. They've got to get the parts in. They've got to figure out what's gone wrong. They've got to get the parts in to fix it, and they've got to get it back online. Because every minute the generator is offline, the owner is losing money.
Yeah.
So there's kind of, we've had this storm of our aging coal-fired power stations have gone out of action. Which is one reason. We've had an unprecedented spike in the cost of coal and gas, which is kind of another reason, which means that our generators are paying more and they're struggling to make their money back on selling the electricity. Now, that kind of protects the brown coal-fired generators in Victoria, because nobody wants to buy brown coal anywhere in the world because it's really dirty stuff, and there's not a lot of global demand for it. So they're kind of protected. So we're not seeing that happen so much, but we are seeing it in Queensland and we are seeing it in New South Wales, where there's been gigawatts of electricity pulled out of the marketplace. And what happens is the market operator, which is AEMO, they have what's called a lack of reserve notice, and that's an LOR. And you might have seen or heard of that in the paper. And there are kind of three stages for an LOR. And basically what happens is the market operator forecasts the difference between the amount of electricity they have available in the marketplace versus the amount of electricity that they need in order to maintain the system and the reliability. And they have what's called a buffer, and it's like, think of it like redundancy. It's like having an extra battery charged up or an extra fuel tank on your car when you go camping. It's that they always have a buffer in the system of available electricity. Yeah. And when that buffer gets a little bit low, it's when the reserve levels are lower than the largest supply of resources in the state. Right. And so what happens is that's called an LOR1. So that happens essentially when there's a little bit of a lack of electricity in the marketplace, or something might have gone offline, or a large customer has to, a large power station unexpectedly goes offline, and there's a drop in reserve. So. And what will happen then is the market operator can then direct people to kind of reduce their electricity. Now, this goes up to LOR2 and then LOR3. And LOR3 is where we've seen that's kind of the bit that starts causing a little bit of sleepless nights for a few people, let's say. So is
that where we are now?
For Queensland and New South Wales, there were LOR3 events forecast at particular times of the day.
Okay.
So earlier in the week, you would have heard Queensland has a forecast deficit of, 1.4 gigawatts or 1,400 megawatts. That's the forecast deficit of electricity, and that they need to start telling customers to turn off. And AEMO intervened and did that. And LOR3 is basically when there's an actual deficit between the supply and the demand of electricity. And this means that there's no reserve supplies available at all, and that what we call load shedding has to occur, which is where you basically have to, start shutting people off. And that's a last resort. And AEMO forecasts these events. And what we saw in the last week was they were forecasting quite a lot of these events happen across Queensland, New South Wales, and Victoria. Now, there are loads of reasons for this. One we spoke about just before about the coal and the gas going up. We spoke about the coal-fired power stations coming offline. But AEMO had also intervened to set a maximum cap on the price of electricity that generators could earn in the marketplace, in the settlements of the marketplace. And what the cap they set was $300 a megawatt hour. And what that meant was some of these generators were not going to be able to make their money back.
Yeah.
And so they have decided not to bid their electricity into the marketplace. Now, rightly or wrongly, I mean, they're making that decision from a commercial perspective, but there is actually a mechanism under the market rules that the Market Commission allows for a reimbursement of costs lost as a due, from not being able to recover your costs from the price of electricity being too low, and if the market operators intervene. So what we saw was a little bit of gaming happen in the marketplace where generators started pulling their electricity out of the bidding, which means that that created these events. So AEMO was all of a sudden saying, right, I don't have this much electricity to bid in the marketplace anymore. Where am I going to get it from? And then that's where we saw the unprecedented move yesterday, where AEMO stepped in and took control.
Wow.
And this is a huge thing for our market, because we wouldn't notice it ordinarily, because the light, like I said, it just switches on or it switches off, right?
Yeah.
And that's how we know. We plug our phones in, or we plug our computer in, or we turn the TV on, or we turn the aircon on, and it just works, right? And so the market operators stepped in to make sure that we have that reliable supply of electricity, and they are ordering generators to turn on and off at certain times in order to meet the demand for electricity.
Even if they don't make money. So what happens with that $300 a megawatt hour? How do they reconcile that? Are they forcing businesses to make a loss by coming online?
The businesses are compensated for their electricity, so they're not going to make a loss, and they can make submissions to the Market Commission in order to recover those costs and be reimbursed. So they're kept whole ultimately. What's happened is that the trading of the electricity has been frozen as well. So we have a settlement system that works where a generator bids into the market, and the demand suppliers, like the retailers, they purchase that electricity and then they on-sell it. And the operator just makes sure that everything's kind of working properly, and there's enough people bidding and there's enough people buying, and they're making sure that there's the right level of what we call it inertia, and the right level of frequency is held in the marketplace, because they have to maintain that as well. And that keeps the whole grid in balance. And that's when you might hear that term a lot about keeping the grid balanced, and that's about making sure that demand of supply is met with enough demand, and also where we have the right frequency in the grid. And so we have things like solar and wind cause, their generation profile, so the way in which they provide that electricity into the grid, it jumps around a lot.
Yeah.
The wind speeds pick up and they slow down, and they pick up and they slow down. And solar, cloud coverage can come overhead and the clouds go away, and so you get this what we call intermittent electricity comes in and out of the grid, and that causes the frequency to jump around. And that's where we see the role of batteries and storage start to come in and even out that frequency. So they provide, and if there's an oversupply of electricity, they provide an immediate load where they demand, where they can provide electricity, or they can provide a demand point where they can take electricity out of the grid
and store it for later, save it for later.
To then put it back into the grid when it needs to come. When there's a demand for that electricity in the grid. So, this is the role of storage, and that's something that I think we were going to talk about a little bit later on. But certainly, where we're at today is that the issues that we are facing, we can assign to specific moments that are happening today, but it's actually, the result of years and years of a lack of action in our energy market. We've had, and it's not just one government. We can't blame it all on a single government over a single time. We've got federal and state governments have done their own types of policy over the last kind of 15 to 20 years and created different pressures in the system. But certainly the last 9 years of having no policy in creating resilience in the marketplace, and when I say in the marketplace, I mean in the generation and storage of electricity, as coal-fired stations, they're gonna go out. They're going to be decommissioned. They're going to be turned off over time. There's no future life for them. Commercially, they don't make enough money. So if there's not a sustainable or an environmental reason not to use the coal-fired power stations, there is certainly a commercial reason that is appearing. That A, today the coal is so expensive. B, these power stations are really expensive to run. And also they cost a lot to maintain, and they're not what we need today, right? We've got a large renewable profile that a resource that we can leverage, and we should be doing that.
Let's get to the solution then. So I'm keen to explore, you talk about coal fires not the future, and it's not about it would have been great if government could have set policy and we could have moved there quicker, but what is the solution? How do we look to more reliable and sustainable energy production and supply?
Yeah, I think, that's such an interesting question to pose, because everyone thinks, solar is going to be the answer, but it's not, and wind's going to be the answer. And they point back to our existing energy system, and, we've got such reliable supply. And at the end of the day, the consumer only thinks that I need energy. So they need confidence that they're going to have electricity there when they need it on demand, because it's very difficult to store it. So one thing to kind of just bear in mind, though, is that the types of generation that we have in our grid is not one. We don't have one single type of generation. We have a lot of coal-fired generation, but we also have a lot of gas. And we also have solar, and we also have wind, and we have hydro. And we've had hydro for a long time. The snowy scheme has been in place for a really long time, as has the Wivenhoe scheme. And there's a lot of hydro on that kind of north central eastern seaboard of Australia. So it's not like moving away from coal is like, well, we don't have anything but coal. We have other things available to us. So
is coal the biggest generator currently? Like, does it make up the most amount?
Yeah, well, I mean, it has done in Victoria, especially. It's over 80% of our generation. But historically, it was the major component of our generation, and phasing it out is a big thing, because we've got a lot of mines. We've got a lot of towns and rural communities attached to those mines. And the lifeblood of some of these rural and regional cities is the coal mining and also the power station. And if you go down to Moe in Victoria, you've got generations of people who have lived and worked on the on the mine site or on the power station, and you might meet some people there that'll say, well, my dad and my granddad, they both worked at Hazelwood, and, I've got a job carting coal at, your lawn or whatever it is, right? And I think it's important that these communities have that very visceral connection to these coal-fired power stations and these mines, and they need to be taken care of. They need to be supported. They need to be on a transition, but it's not like we haven't done this transition before. I mean, you and I have spoken to this about Gladstone because you come from Gladstone, or
Yep.
grew up in Gladstone for a bit, and Gladstone's been through multiple changes. It had the coal generation and the coal boom, and then it had the gas boom, and now it's going through a bit of a hydrogen renaissance. And people are like, oh, we can't change in Gladstone. It's like, well, hang on a second. Gladstone's an energy powerhouse that has always changed.
Yeah.
And this is just the next change. But getting to your point about what is the solution, I think I've answered in a really long-winded way, just to say that there is no single solution.
Yeah.
Our future energy system is going to be a combination of solar and onshore wind and offshore wind and batteries with fast frequency response and pumped hydro for long duration storage, plus hydrogen in there for some part of our fuel mix. Because remember, when we talk about energy, you and I have spoken a little bit about electricity, but gas forms a big part of our energy demand, and petrol and petroleum products, so whether it's oil or diesel or whatever, also forms a big part of our energy demand because we all drive cars. So, our energy demand and our energy profile and the way in which we consume that is going to change over time. I think people will continue to drive cars. I don't think that's going to change. But how we get our energy, where we get it from, the type of energy it is going to change, and it's going to be this mixture.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to dive into hydrogen because I know that's close to your heart and something you're very knowledgeable about. So I'd like to understand, first up, how hydrogen fits into the solution, but then what's preventing hydrogen from really being mass produced and replacing all of these old coal-fired power stations?
Yeah, I think so. Hydrogen was touted, 50 years ago as being the fuel of the future, or the future fuel that we could use. The problem has always been, how do we harness it and how do we make it cheaply? Electrolysis, so the process of having electricity split water into hydrogen and oxygen, has and is becoming, or has become, one of the most efficient ways of making hydrogen without any hydrocarbons. And so previously we have made hydrogen from either gasification or steam methane reformation, which is when you take natural gas and you use steam and you kind of reform the natural gas into being methane and carbon and hydrogen. You capture the hydrogen. And that's great, but it's not great for the environment. So hydrogen is, this via electrolysis, so using electricity to make it, is seen as being a green way of doing it. And you would have heard the term green hydrogen used a lot, and that's where you use renewable electricity to create hydrogen. Now, the canny users that you have listening to this podcast, we were like, hang on a second, if you connect it to the grid, you just said that the grid's got coal-fired electricity in it, so it's not really green. And that's true. There's a lot of projects being developed at the moment that are looking at hydrogen as a behind the meter application, which is where you have electricity generation, so a solar farm with a wind farm, or a standalone wind farm, or whatever it is, that is directly connected to a hydrogen electrolyzer, and that creates the hydrogen without connecting to the grid at all. And so that's where you get real, like, proper green hydrogen, because there's no carbon involved in that system. And electrons, they don't know if they're green or brown or turquoise or blue or gold, whatever color you want them to be. They don't know, right? An electron is an electron. It's about how we classify it. And you'll see things like certificates of origin is thrown around, which is about classifying the hydrogen that you've got as being green or not green. And you would have heard things like carbon capture and storage. But I think, to your point,
it's the waste, isn't it? Like, it's, we don't want to kind of make another system that's as wasteful or dirty as what coal was, so I think we'd like hydrogen, if we could make it in a way that was actually sustainable and environmentally good for our planet, that would be so much better for everyone in the long term.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And your question about what's preventing hydrogen is really, it's developing at the moment. It's a phase that's developing. It's in a phase of, it's done its research, it's doing development, it's in deployment, and now it's just a cost and supply chain issue. And that's the same as all new technologies. They all go through it.
Yep.
Solar went through it. I'm not sure if you knew anyone who put solar panels on their roof back in the early 2000s, but it was kind of $25,000 to $30,000 to put a small kind of 3 kilowatt system on your roof. Now you can put a 6 or 7 kilowatt system on your roof for $2,500 once you get the rebates from government. So, technology improves, supply chain improves, costs come down, and it becomes more accessible. And now solar is, the cheapest form of electricity that we can produce. So storing that solar is a different issue altogether. But at the end of the day, it is the cheapest source of electricity that we can produce. Notwithstanding people thinking that fusion nuclear will provide free power forever for everybody, but that's another. I think that's another
Yes.
podcast entirely, Nicole.
I will need to get you back on nuclear.
Oh well, yeah. After my time in the nuclear power stations, yeah. So, what's preventing it is just that time, that maturity of technology to get to the point where it gets to scale, it gets a supply chain, there's a demand for it. These are all things that developing markets need to do. I think the difference with hydrogen, as opposed to some of these other markets, has been there's a huge global push behind it now, because it's seen as a viable product that can help decarbonize a whole range of systems. So you can use hydrogen in heavy freight and haulage. You can use hydrogen in high heat industrial applications. You can use it in your gas burner and your cooktop and your hot water service and that sort of thing. It can be interchanged. Now, the appliance needs to change as well, but that's the same as if you want to fully electrify your house. You can't use your gas cooker if you've got full electricity. You've got to get an induction cooktop or an electric cooktop to go in. So, there's pros and cons for all of this sort of stuff. At the end of the day, hydrogen, I believe, has a role to play in our future energy mix. I think it is still trying to determine what that role is.
Yeah.
But it will play a role, because it's a versatile energy vector that can be used across a whole range of applications. So for chemical production, whether you want to create ammonia and ammonium nitrate for fertilizer and explosives, or if you want to use it as a hydrogen gas in trucks in order to do long, heavy haulage trucking, or even as a sustainable aviation fuel in the future. And that's, it's one of those kind of things that can cut across markets. And there are places, and there's places for full electrification, obviously. And we had Alan Finkel in at Arup a little while ago talking to us about what do you need to do to hit net zero, and he was talking about electrify everything that you possibly can, and those things that are too hard or too difficult or too expensive, look to hydrogen as an opportunity to gas.
Yeah. All right, Patrick, we have a couple of minutes left, but I'd love to touch on what projects Arup are leading globally to unlock more opportunities in hydrogen. I know a lot of what you do is under wraps, but what can you share with the listeners to give them a taste of what's coming?
Yeah, I mean, we've found at this stage of the development of the industry globally, we are working with developers and, let's say, project developers to look at really exciting large-scale projects to develop hydrogen either as a domestic use or as an international export. And that's in Australia and New Zealand. You'll be aware of some of the stuff we've done, but Southern Green Hydrogen is one of the projects that we're doing in New Zealand, where we're supporting Meridian and Contact in their very public project, which is to look for a use for 600 megawatts of electricity to convert into hydrogen. And then, what can that be, and where can they use it? In Australia, we're doing a lot of policy and strategy advice and also project development, but we're advising the federal government and a whole range of state governments on different uses of hydrogen. So hydrogen infrastructure assessments is one thing that we're running for the federal government here. In the Americas, we're advising the Chilean government on how they can look at hydrogen as a real opportunity for them to decarbonise or future-proof their standalone power systems and their microgrids that they have. We're doing a lot of work in America around gas blending and using hydrogen in the gas network. And so we've looked at stuff in the both the eastern and the western parts of America. Europe and the UK, we have a huge amount of activity in hydrogen. So whether that's decarbonisation of industrial areas, we're working on the Humber decarbonisation precinct in the UK. We're doing a lot of work in the Netherlands and in Spain, which seems to be real hotspots for hydrogen at the moment. The Port of Rotterdam is looking to import, I think it's 4 million tonnes of hydrogen by 2050. So 4 million tonnes a year by 2050. And that's just
Wow.
that's so to put that in perspective, and to at today's kind of levels of efficiency, 1 million tonnes of hydrogen is around about kind of somewhere between 15 and 20 gigawatts, depending on your electricity profile. So 4 million tonnes is going to be somewhere, up to kind of 80 gigawatts. Australia's entire energy system is around about 60 gigawatts.
Wow.
So just the Port of Rotterdam wants to import more hydrogen from a megawatt generation perspective than Australia's entire electricity system is today. We're doing some work on liquid hydrogen in Japan and looking at liquid hydrogen supply chains. And we've been working with a lot of the Japanese consortium, Japanese general trading houses, and we're doing a lot of work in Singapore around like the role of hydrogen for Singapore, because obviously Singapore has been a traditional base of fuel bunkering for years, hundreds of, well, not hundreds of years, but 100 years. It's had bunkering and offshore refueling and that sort of thing. So, Singapore obviously has to go through a bit of a change being on a trade route. I think Africa is the other area where we're doing a bit of work as well in hydrogen. We've seen some really exciting projects in Southern Africa and in Namibia, and it's just there's just a lot going on. The only thing I will say, it just kind of reflecting on one of your questions earlier about what's holding hydrogen back, is I think that today we are holding hydrogen as a green fuel to a much higher standard than our existing fuel uses. And I think that that's something that we need to rectify and say, right, the goal is to decarbonize. It's not about how much does this cost because we can calculate everything in it. It's about looking at our current energy system and saying that cost is immense. Can we continue to do that? And the answer is no, we can't. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's about iteratively getting better, right? We don't need to kind of nail perfection from the beginning. We just need to continually move forward so that we can actually get to something that is, much more sustainable and reliable and environmentally conscious into the future, I think.
Absolutely. And I mean, if you think about it, just going back to that point that I made before about taking care of these communities that are currently around these coal-fired power stations, given the size of the opportunity here, we have, there are millions of jobs available for these projects to develop. They need workers, they need fitters and turners, they need manufacturing, they need all this work, right? So there are options in the future. I think it's just about how we communicate them, how we locate them in the right spots, and how we effectively transition people. So
totally agree. Nicely concluded. Thank you. It's been fantastic having you on the podcast, Patrick. We could literally keep talking for another couple of hours, I think, and we would still have more to talk about. But that was just really fantastic. And I think the listeners will really gain something totally different out of that episode to what we have covered in the past. But I'll need to listen to that a couple of times to actually sink it all in, because you say things as though it's so obvious. But for many of us who are not in that, deeply in the industry like you are, it is certainly not obvious. So thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Nicole. I really appreciate it. Had lots of fun.
That's awesome. And thank you for tuning into the Hustle and Bustle podcast this week. If you've enjoyed this episode, please leave us a rating and a review. You can follow the show on Instagram and LinkedIn too. That's all from this episode. Thanks again for listening. I'll catch you next time. Bye for now.